The first CNC router I got, make CNC-STEP from Germany, running software called WinPC-NC Professional. I run this from a PC with Win 2000 on it. An RS-232 COM port communicates with a fairly large box, which then in turn separately and independently generates all the steps for the interpolation. This outputs via a Centronics port to the controller with built-in 48-volt switch mode PSU. The PSU supplies power to the steppers and the controller. The controller uses 9-pin RS-232 style connectors for 4-axis and the limit switches. For each coil in the motors, 2 pins and wires are shared to handle the load. The X-axis has 2 connectors, 2 motors, 2 ball screws to achieve a wide, lightweight machine without binding. But did I really need a CNC router? I started off like I suppose most people of my generation, hand-making machines and gadgets out of iron and steel. I switched to aluminium because it was easier to work with. It was cleaner, didn't need painting, and I was fed up with the effort and energy needed for tapping holes. Nuts and bolts have their limitations when using all-screw construction. Welding parts doesn't allow a lot of flexibility in prototype design. I was not happy to tap aluminium, as there are lots of gorillas out there who will force threads, borrow your drill, allowing the bit to slip, wearing out the chuck, generally treating other people's equipment and their employers like shit, and then calling it shit. So I would use captive nuts in aluminum. For example, with an M6 nylock nut, I would drill a 6.8mm through hole, then enlarge part of it to 10.8mm and push or draw a nut into it. I would have, over the years, pushed well over 100,000 M6 nylocks into aluminium against the chuck jaws of this little lathe using a 5mm shaft and a spacer in the tailstock chuck. I was expecting a lot of wear on the tailstock Acme screw, but it was okay. I kind of view mechanics as making holes, all of different sizes, orientations and spacing apart. Holes for fulcrums, holes for fixing, holes for bushes and bearings, shafts, etc. The medium, whether metal, plastic, whatever, is just to hold the holes. In the olden days, when my eyesight was better, I would cut material to size, draw any face of the component in 2D with crosshairs where the holes were with AutoCAD, print onto paper 1:1 ratio, cut the paper shape with a guillotine or scissors, tape paper sheets together if a big component, use fingers, tape or magnets to hold the paper in place, use an automatic center punch on the crosshairs, drill a small true hole, then use progressively larger drill bits, enlarging the holes on a drill press from both sides, meeting in the middle of each hole until happy. Using captive nuts with aluminium or plastic allows a nut to be replaced if a thread is pulled and the component is not guntered. I used 3mm end mills on the router for most jobs with a 3mm shaft. 1/8 of an inch with a 1/8 of an inch shaft would be okay too, but it's best not to chop and change to avoid confusion if in need to cut the same component again. The 3mm end mill allows me to have captive nuts from M3 upwards. The same size shaft allows me to cut way deeper than the flutes. An end mill will last for a year or more, usually breaking if there is no mist with plastic or banging into something with the spindle off, not looking for obstacles when moving it away from the work. The mist stroke spit, which is water, is generated with these little Noga jobbies, quite popular on router and milling machines, but not a great design. The individual blue plastic components which allow the pipe to flex and bend retaining an inner air tube down to the nozzle, are prone to leaking whenever they are disturbed. They need to hold a small vacuum to be able to draw water up from a reservoir. I suppose it is time to make some polythene tubes from a plastic bag and secure one over each end with 2 elastic bands. Up to now I have avoided tool changes so as not to disturb the mister when it is working properly. There is also a banjo fitted on these ones with a hole down the centre of an M5 screw and some small side holes. These need to be replaced with stainless as they clog with rust if the machines are left idle for some time. This machine has 5 steppers, 1 each for Y, Z and U and 2 for X. The rotary table U is mounted upright with a tool stock. I use an extension spindle mount to gain some height when using the 4th axis. This mount can also be used if I wish to cut something tall in front of the router. When using the 4th axis to cut in degrees or engrave numbers, graduations, etc. around a shaft, I would draw the X dimension as standard, but the Y dimension would be 360. Then in G-code, when the Y-axis is centered over the part, each reference to Y is replaced with a U. There is no on-screen view of what is being cut, but who cares? A straight line is okay. Every so often this machine would screw up and need to be rehomed. The LEDs and their flash codes would not indicate why. This could happen 3 times in the middle of a job, 5 times in a day, not again for a month or 2. It was quite erratic and frustrating. When this happened, it knew where the work positions were relative to the home positions. Maybe that part of the job was no longer there, so that was the only way to save the work done so far. But was it? The homing switches on this machine are normally closed reed switches, type B probably. When I turn on a machine, I first home it. Each axis moves slowly towards its limit switch until it opens, then moves slowly away until it closes again. This position is recorded by the controller. Now the axis moves an additional distance away from the limit switch, which I have currently set as 5 mm. This position is now recorded as 0 in the machine coordinate system for that particular axis. First U, then Z, then Y, and finally X are done. I measure from particular points on the machine with a vernier each day when I first start up the machine and record these values and the date on paper. They are consistent with slight differences which I would put down to temperature or my ability to hold a vernier perpendicular over 60 odd millimeters. I could get myself 9 indicators, mount them to the machines, and 0 each after first homing each day. Next I would move to the workpiece I was cutting and set X, Y and Z to 0, Z with the height block. If the part has a front left corner, X and Y are set by dropping the tool below Z0, turning on the spindle, then stepping up to the work, first in 1 mm increments, then 1/10 of a millimeter, and finally 1/100th of a millimeter increments. Ears will inform when the tool contacts the edge of the work. I back away by 1/100th of a millimeter, then again by 5 millimeters minus the radius of the tool. I incorporate a 5 millimeter border around my work stock when drawing and profiling it, so as not to have to use negative values for X and Y in the G-code. Once determined, I zero out the part, write down the G-code profile number, the tool type and diameter, the material and its depth, the machine coordinates for X, Y and Z 0 points, and finally, after the job completes, the cutting time to the nearest second. If this machine was cutting a part that took, say, 9 hours, then it cut another and another, the time for each part would be within 1 second. I imagine it is more exact than this, but the timer only outputs to the nearest second, and who knows how far from the PC's second tick marks the start and stop point were. The other two routers use a USB to Centronics interface, and they each could cut a similar 2-hour job, being out by plus or minus 15 seconds or more each time. When a machine screws up in the middle of a job due to an erratic malfunction, it retains the workpiece 0 points unless the PC needs to be rebooted. However, it needs to be rehomed before continuing. When the machine is running, the read limit switches, being normally closed, have a voltage and a tiny current flowing through them. This seems to induce some kind of residual magnetic flux in them, and the homing position can vary from a cold start by as much as 0.7 of a millimeter. Vernier out again, log the fault, which in this case was momentary and no longer revealed. Write down the new home values. Use these values to recalculate the new machine coordinates for the workpiece 0 points. The faces originally used may no longer be there to work from. Then continue with the job, hoping to get to the end without having to repeat again. Screw up in calculations, break the tool, and save the part. Not always the case. It is strange how these problems always happen at just the wrong moment. Eventually, after about 3 years, the machine failed good and proper, and the LEDs and flash codes could point to the problem. The power supply was dropping voltage. When it failed, the PSU was only generating 44 volts, which wouldn't allow it to run. Some onboard chip could monitor this drop and signal a fault. It's a pity that it couldn't latch it until a reset. I replaced the PSU with 2 by 24 volt units, powered in parallel with their outputs wired in series, and now this machine is reliable and dependable. The PSU for this lathe project will be done the same way, plus a separate PSU for the controls. I still use the vernier every time I home the machine. Who knows when there will be a power cut, etc. This is going on and on. I am beginning to hear the muscle men in the back of my head shouting, "Whoa, you done my brain in." To conclude, fortunately the other two routers with the USB to Centronics boxes can screw up from time to time and fail to transmit data. In these cases a PC reboot and a rehoming are required, but it will give me a chance to collect more information as to why these tiny read switches are so peculiar, if they are type B, E, etc., before sorting out the USB problem. So far, I reversed the leads on one of the switches. I reckon I will need eventually to replace the reads with Hall effect or limit switches. I suppose it is time to change the subject, lest I be accused of monomania. I will have to come back to why I altered G-code at another time. I suppose I should also explain why I do such fine cuts with these 3mm end mills, but not now. I have talked enough techie talk to have sent the riffraff packing, and can talk now of other things, whatever I like.
In September 1937, I bought my wife a new electric iron for 8 and 6pence. She's still using it every day and it's never needed repair.
He managed to get himself a good model there. It sounds like she was rightly screwed. I suppose another of her chores was to wash the reusable rubber sheath purchased with a clandestine nod and wink in a brown paper package with a bottle of hair oil from his barber shop to safeguard his John Thomas against unwanted progeny or expense. For good Catholic Ireland it was different. Family planning in the form of pills, rubber or latex were forbidden by law until the 1980s, when condoms were eventually allowed. A doctor's prescription and proof of marriage were required. Some pharmacies were conscientious objectors, and this was tolerated. This may seem ridiculous, but don't worry. They always find a way to be one step behind the times, ensuring the current generation is oppressed. When it comes to one human being's ability to dictate and control to another, power is synonymous with abuse. After all, in the minds of those who crave power, what is power if not the ability to control others, to demand respect for one's position and social status? These people are so misguided that they feel that when others kowtow to their intimidation, that this is respect shown to them. Of course, the politician can be all sweetness and light, while some paid state employee / thug stands behind him with the dagger's look of, "We know who you are, and if you are not our friend, then you are an enemy." Sex was a dirty word in Ireland, not so for the local parish priest. There was a good room in most houses, unused, cold, and always tidy, should the priest come to visit, where he was offered tea. He could pry into a new housewife's sex life, reaffirm in her role and responsibility in ensuring the sanctity of the sacrament of marriage, and offer instruction and advice in the practice of the Billings method and how to take her temperature. Whenever, to this day, I am at a family function or out with my father and we meet someone who I do not know, he will introduce me as his second eldest son. Then he will say that I was conceived on his birthday. We are talking of a time when sex between married couples had so much embedded shame attached that it only occurred in total darkness. When I was a little fishy, I must have been quite the Speedy Gonzales to have reached my goal by midnight. There were a lot of sexually frustrated husbands, often driven to drink, and wives fearful of another pregnancy each night as they entered the marital bed. Many an Irish child was most likely conceived following an orchestrated, bitter fight, followed by make-up sex, as the existing children witnessed this fiasco. Birth was normal, no need for forceps, held upside down by the feet to drain out, a slap on the butt to start me wailing, then wrapped in a coarse hospital towel after being wiped down. The irony is, that hospital towel was probably laundered by a girl or woman institutionalized into service to profit the state and a religious organization. After becoming pregnant outside marriage, it may have been a family member or father forced upon her. The parish priest would have her taken away. She would be outcast by family and community, whose sanctimonious virtue must prevail, notwithstanding. A good-looking child would fetch a high price, donation of course, from a good Catholic childless American couple. A weak or ugly child would not flourish and may end up dead in a sewer or unmarked bit of ground. The value of human life is no more than what can be realized from it. Following a recent referendum, at least the next generation has the right not to be born. A small compensation, seeing as people from our generation have already stolen from them. Every child should have the right to be born free. Many girls did not end up in mother and baby homes. Most towns and villages have known places where they could go to quietly slit their wrists, saving themselves and their community from shame. They could not be buried on hallowed ground, and would be damned forever, but of course they would avoid hell on earth. Some time after I was born, when the novelty wore off for my older brother, and he realized that he no longer had exclusivity for my parents' attention, he was caught with a heavy saucepan over his head, about to bring it crashing down on mine, intending to split my head open, getting rid of the competition. I was told this a number of times by my parents. I would not have had words to remember, and probably didn't have eye contact with my adversary at the time. I was also told by my parents that at the age of 1.5, I was accidentally left in a bath overnight. Again, I take their word for it, coupled with the guilt and shame that accompanied the admission. When I was 3/4, and now living down in a country town, one day, after very heavy rains, the whole family decided to walk down to a meadow before an arched bridge close to our home to see the river in flood. It had broke the banks in places. It was quite ferocious, gushing downstream at speed. I was standing at the edge, looking into the fast-flowing water and kicking at the eroded grass and soil with my welly boot heel. My family were upstream of me. Next thing, the ground gave way beneath me, and I was flowing quickly downstream. I couldn't swim. My mother let out a screech like a banshee. I was calm. It all happened so fast. A kid much older than me, about 100 yards downstream, reached in and caught me and pulled me out. In that town there was a sugar beet factory, close to where we lived. There was a field, I suppose about 100 meters wide. It is hard to know now, as the size of things recalled is relative to the size you were then. The soil from this field had been scooped out, and it was used as a slurry pit for the slurry left after making sugar. Aged 5/6, my friends and I would each get 2 planks, whatever we could find, and walk across it, taking the board from behind and putting it in front, not lingering too long, as you would sink. It would take an hour or two to get all the way across. Sometimes one of us would get stuck, none further than the waist, but the others would come around and pull them up. We lost boots, of course, and sandals. Our parents didn't know. We would wash off with a garden hose. We did know, however, that it was a dangerous undertaking. One day, aged 8 or 9, living in a different town, I was in the kitchen, having made myself some toast and milky coffee. We had an electric cooker, but we also had what was called an aga cooker. This burnt anthracite and was always lighting, the main source of heat in the house. There was always a kettle simmering on the edge of one of the rings. There was no central heating in those days. 2 circular meshed wire frames hinged together with handles held the bread for toasting over one of the hot plates. We would toast on one side of the bread and put jam on the toasted side, sandwiching all together, with the outer sides being soft white bread, giving a crunchy interior. Other families would put the jam on the soft side and have a crunchy exterior. And then strangest of all were those who toasted both sides of the bread. The coffee was a cooking syrup. I wasn't allowed Maxwell House or the like in those days. I was sitting at the table eating my toasted jam sandwich and swigging at my coffee when suddenly I got a stinging pain across my face. My older brother had quietly snuck behind me, yielding a curtain wire, those coiled metal springs coated in plastic with an eye at each end for putting up net curtains. He lashed me across the head with one of these from behind. He laughed and dashed out the back kitchen door. This was very painful, unprovoked and unexpected. He could have cost me an eye. I went after him. He had locked the kitchen door from the outside with the key. I could hear him laughing aloud. I put both hands to the door handle and was pushing on it with my shoulder. Unbeknownst to me, he removed a fuse from the fuse box outside the door and put one end of the wire into the fuse holder. Then he put the other end onto the handle of the door. I was stuck there, getting 240 volts until he decided to release me. When he released me, he unlocked the door and came in, amused by his joke while swinging his curtain wire in case I retaliated. I could do nothing and was some time recovering. He enjoyed his prank. Each of these situations and others could have had a different outcome, and you and I would not be doing this here now. I do not accept the notion of multiverses, no matter how many theoretical physicists awarded funding and educated beyond their intelligence claim that us mere mortals just do not understand. The world we have is the world as is. In my opinion, one of the greatest atrocities of the last century was that academic institutions throughout the world discontinued investigation into the Milgram experiment for so-called ethical reasons. It is more likely that it was stopped because it would have revealed that all institutions and organizations, including their own, are riddled with abusers. All the barrels are full of rotten apples. Abuse is not about a time in the history of mankind or sexual. It is about control, one human being trying to exercise control over another. Until there comes a time when people are psychologically profiled and prevented from exercising their evil intent. But as I have already said, all the barrels are full of rotten apples. Still, there is a glimpse of hope. The Earth could be struck by an asteroid, and we could start afresh in a few million years or so. Interesting YouTube stuff. Corruption, abusive land grab of family farm. This is the story of Martha Benetta, uploaded by Property Rights and Farming Alliance. After watching this, I looked for a documentary I had seen on British TV. It was there and called You've Been Trumped, 2011. Donald Trump documentary, The Aberdeen Golf Course Disaster. Subscribe if you want to. Thanks for listening and/or watching. Ciao.